Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best and one of the very worst recordings of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. Now, this is a video that I have been procrastinating about for quite a while. First of all, there are 30 trillion recordings of this concerto, and that's true of a lot of standard repertoire. Let's call it what it is. But it's even worse with this concerto because, first of all, so many violins have made multiple versions of it. And second of all, it exists in multiple versions itself, because there's what Tchaikovsky actually wrote, then there is the tweaked version by Leopold Auer, and then there are the various cuts that you can make in the first movement and the finale. Well, there's sort of one big one in the first movement, and then there's a bunch of little ones in the finale, but everyone does their thing. Naturally, I prefer to hear it the way Tchaikovsky wrote it, because he's a great composer, and it's beautiful music, and it's not a problem for me. But if you think for 1 minute I'm going to jump up and down and make an issue about the fact that some people do cuts and some people don't do cuts, and whether I like them or don't like them, and have a whole sort of sanctimonious moral hysteria about it, that ain't me. I'm not going there. I just like the ones I like, and if it's cut, it's cut, and if it isn't cut, it's not cut, and more power to them. So I will let the sanctimonious few point fingers and try and make the moral case one way or another. I am not going to bother. But because the piece, I think, has this sort of built-in, shall we say, flexibility as regards both form and the actual violin part, it's kind of been taken for granted. And there's no question about it that the piece invites the kind of interpretive excess that really, really brings into the equation the issue of taste. The taste of the soloist, the taste of the listener, taste. And that's a whole nother consideration as well, because there are performances that run from the hot and heavy, slobbering, romantic, vile, nauseating type. Most, perhaps, in terms of famous names, most graphically represented by the latest Anna-Sophie Mutter, which is just, ugh. That's one of the worst, but that's not the one I'm talking about. And to extremely elegant and beautifully proportioned and finely considered and something that turns it into a piece of true poetry. I mean, we all, I think, prefer the poetry, but sometimes poetry is hot and heavy, and it's no worse for that. And so we like a little of that too. I mean, the piece has a lot of built-in schmaltz, and the schmaltz is just part of the music, and you have to just deal with it. I really disliked this piece for a very, very long time. I really did. I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it, because it just, for me, had too much violin. I mean, I was just waiting for the violin to stop and for the orchestra to do something. I mean, in the first movement, it gets going, and when that big tutti, in Polonaise rhythm, yum ba da 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 da, and the underneath the orchestra's going yum ba da da dum bum 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 ba da da. Oh, it's wonderful. I was like, jeez, I thought we'd never get there. Oh, thank God, finally. Because Tchaikovsky does keep you waiting, and then has an awful lot of fiddling going on. And what's more, I never liked double stops. You know what a double stop is? When you play the violin, the violin can play 2, even 3 notes more or less at the same time. What you do is you stop the strings appropriately, or you leave one open and stop one, or you do whatever, and then you take your bow and you whack both strings, because you have to get the right angle, and it goes like this. I think double stops sound like you're torturing a cat. And I have a cat, and I know what it sounds like, so trust me. And the last time I played something with a lot of double stops, my cat answered it. So she knew what it was, too. I'm serious. I just think most of the time they sound ugly and out of tune. And quite often they do sound ugly and out of tune. You've got to get a player who knows how to play double stops beautifully in tune. And there aren't many of them. And when you have tons and tons and tons of double stops, as you do in this concerto, you have many, 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 many opportunities to make ugly and out of tune sounds. And it just the grinding, scratchy sound of the violin part, always put me off. Gradually, I came to understand it and listen, and I heard great performances, which of course sold me on the piece. So I'm very particular, generally speaking, about the performances that I enjoy, and I really get my back up when people monkey with it too much, because, like I said, the monkey business is all in there. You don't have to do that much with it to make a very, very beautiful, respectable interpretation. Now, of course, genius is a whole nother question, right? I mean, there are people who can, and we will be talking about them, who can do amazing things with the text and with the shape of the text and with tempo and rubato and all that kind of cool stuff. So there are wonderful, wonderful performances of those pieces. I have selected 16 or 17 of them, and we've already talked about one that I dislike, so that doesn't count, the ones I don't like. But I do want to talk about possibly the most horrible performance of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto that I've heard in like a billion zillion years. It is really atrociously bad, and I'm even going to read the review that I wrote of it, which is password protected at classicstoday.com because it's so special. But what the heck, I don't care. It's this one with Patricia Kopachinskaya and Musica Eterna under Theodore Korensis. Now it's coupled with Stravinsky's Les Noces, so the wedding. So the whole thing here is wedding based. I mean, if you look at the cover here, it's sort of like some grotesque Russian peasant version of The Last Supper, which is supposed to introduce the spiritual element. Look at this again. I mean, isn't that just horrifying? So that's Korensis and Kopachinskaya. And this is a very wonderful representation of what they actually do to the music, which is basically, crap all over it, Dadaistically. But we're going to get to that. I want to share with you the review of this horror show that I wrote. I mean, it's just so vulgar. It's random, and it's vulgar, and it's pretentious, and it's desperate to do something different, and desperate to prove that it's a great work of music. No one realized it until they got their claws on it. That's what it was. Oh my God, it's just terrifying. I mean, I just hope that the caterer pushed them into the cake. Ugh. Anyway, here is my review, which is in the form of a letter, because this is, of course, their wedding. I mean, it's the wedding thing. So I thought that I should write them a fabulous little letter congratulating them on their wedding. I mean, they're not really married. Don't worry. So here we are. Dear Patricia and Theo, I was so deeply moved by the charming letters that you wrote to each other and which comprised the booklet notes of your new performance of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. Yeah, that's how they did it. That I felt compelled to respond in kind. I was particularly struck, Patricia, by the rhetorical gusto with which you asked these questions, quote, "What is it that music does to us?" unquote. What indeed, I wondered while listening. What does it mean to open our souls to sorrow on this scale, to yield ourselves prostrate before the infinite, to forget who we are? Musicians, perhaps? On evidence here? Nah, no. Quote, to turn into a raw nerve of vulnerability. Raw is truly the word for your playing, my dear. It's definitely raw. And Theo, surely you are wise to point out that, quote, it is impossible to descend the chromatic scales of nostalgia with lies, unquote. Everyone knows that one can only descend the diatonic scales of nostalgia with lies. Such depth, such insight. It is so clear to me that the music making offered here comes from the very bowels of your beings. I suspect, however, that the bowels that you had in mind and the ones that I believe characterize the performance might not be the same. Certainly the two of you achieved your goal, which is to be different at all costs, any costs. How well I understand, Patricia, that this is what you meant when you say, quote, "For a long time the Tchaikovsky Concerto was alien to me. To my ears it didn't have any music relevant to our own time. Moronic violinism, that's what I thought of it," unquote. How perfectly this characterizes your own performance. What else explains the fact that Tchaikovsky marks the solo part of the canzonetta molto espressivo, and you play it with the most glacial wisp of tone possible, utterly devoid of expression? Why should we take literally Tchaikovsky's naive suggestion that a piece called a canzonetta requires a warm cantabile melodic line, like a song? Why else would you impose such a wealth of interpretive graffiti on the simple solo cadenza before the finale, which otherwise flies by at a pace that defies any possible subtlety of characterization? Moronic violinism, indeed. I would think of other adjectives as well. Narcissistic, unmusical, charmless, and all of it underpinned, Teo, by the usual micromanaged vivisection of the orchestral accompaniment that passes in your hands for interpretation. But why bother? Indeed, I can't help but wonder why you both feel it necessary to play even the notes that Tchaikovsky himself wrote. Clearly they hold little interest, other than as a blank slate on which to scribble whatever random foolishness happens to come into your minds, or rather, bowels. Please excuse my pedantry, then, if I insist on the distinction between artistry, which involves the ability to project your own personality from within the idiomatic style of the work, and the affectations of a couple of well-trained poseurs. That said, the black and white photos that adorn the cover and the booklet, with the two of you impersonating bride and groom, do put a rather creepy gloss on the whole production. I can't help but notice how the artificiality and pretension of the little game of dress-up that you evidently enjoyed playing finds such a precise analog in the very sounds that you produce. Here's the pièce de résistance. Look at that. Oh, isn't that romantic? Aren't they the charming couple? Look at that. Ugh. I mean, it looks like some sort of like horror movie or something. I don't know. Ugh, yuck. Okay. Anyway. And so, dear friends, I leave you with the sincere hope that in conceiving this production, you have had a good laugh at the public's expense and are enjoying your private joke. It was a good one. You have created a party record that I will not soon forget. The alternative, namely that the two of you are serious, is too depressing to contemplate. With best wishes, Dave. So there you are, possibly the most horrible, certainly the most horrible modern recording of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto by two complete narcissistic musical, whatever you want to call them. You make it up. All right, let's talk about the good ones, shall we? Let's get rid of that. Whoop! Oh, I'll throw it. Good enough. There you go. Piece of junk. Let's talk about the better ones, of which there are no shortage. So I'm going to start actually with a historical one. Normally, I don't get into historical recordings, as you know, because there are just so many fabulous modern ones. And I believe, for people who know the work really well, you already know what the discography is, you know what the historical ones are. And so I don't really need to go there. But for people who don't know it well, who only may have one recording and are looking for an alternative, or who are just getting familiar with it, you've got to hear the music. So that means you've got to hear the whole thing. So, yes, there's Bronislaw Huberman and all those other people. They're wonderful. We love them, and that's that. Next, the farthest back that I think I'm going to go is, 1952. Yes, 1952. This is a fantastic performance. Erika Morini, who was a marvelous violinist, and it's with Ferenc Fricsay. Conducting with the Berlin RAIS Orchestra. What could be bad? We all know that Fricsay was amazing in Tchaikovsky as an accompanist, and Morini just smokes in this performance. It's just a blazing performance with other, short works attached to it. And it's on Audita, and it's absolutely wonderful. So if you're interested in historical recordings or older recordings, you might want to start here. It's in good sound, you can hear everything, and the playing is just dynamite. So, yes, to Morini. Next. Well, a lot of you sort of, get annoyed with me when I do these violin things because I haven't spent much time talking about Heinrich Schering. And I'm sorry about that because he was a wonderful, wonderful violinist. I have the big Schering box up there. There's tons of stuff. I mean, he did lots and lots of recordings, and he was marvelous. He really was. But there's just so much good stuff, and somehow, I just didn't get to him the way I probably ought to. I think one of the reasons is because it isn't a big box that I have buried over there in the big boxes. And when you have singleton recordings, I can look under the T's for Tchaikovsky and pull out the CDs, or under S for Sibelius or B for Brahms or whatever the Tchaikovsky is coupled with, and I can find a whole pile of individual CDs. But with Schering, it's all in the box. So I have to go and get the box. And I'm just too lazy sometimes. And it's my fault. So I apologize to all the Schering fans because he's wonderful. I mean, he really is wonderful. And he is wonderful in this recording with Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony. It's definitely a fabulous Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. And, there you go. There's your Heinrich Schering. It's a big, bold, gutsy, romantic, passionate, but not grotesque performance of the concerto. It really is beautiful, and I love listening to it. It's in this is the Munch Late Romantic Masterpieces box. At least that winnows the size of the box down a little bit. You know what I mean? I actually have it on a single disc too, and it's in the Munch edition, but I'm not. And it's in the big Munch box. But I'm not worried about that. I just want you to know that Schering is out there, and he's terrific. And if you like him, help yourself. I think he did it a couple of times too. Actually, there's one on Mercury too, isn't there? I don't know. It's just so much stuff. So much stuff. But with Munch, I think you're in really good shape. Next. Oh, yeah. Hilary Hahn. You have to talk about Hilary Hahn. She is one of the great violinists out there today. And what's nice about this performance is that as usual with her recordings, she likes to couple intriguing pieces together, like she did Sibelius and Schoenberg, and she did some, Beethoven and Bernstein, and now she has the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto and Jennifer Higdon's Violin Concerto, which is a lovely contemporary work. And so this is wonderful to have, and it's with the Royal Liverpool Phil and Vasily Petrenko, who is a wonderful conductor, as you know from his Naxos Shostakovich series, and you know it from here. She accompanies beautifully. And this is a fun coupling. I like it when you have two nicely complementary works on the disc. Sometimes these couplings can go terribly wrong because the two pieces have nothing to do with each other. It's like terrifying. I remember, who was it? Alicia Weilerstein or whatever, the cellist who did something like Elgar and Elliott Carter or something like that. That was not a great idea. Excuse me. It really wasn't, because no one who wants one is really going to want the other, and the two of them don't have any points of contact. Even Sibelius and Schoenberg have something, but that didn't. So these do, though, because Higdon is a contemporary composer who writes in that, what you might call a neo-romantic vein, and she's a tremendously gifted and colorful composer, and this is lovely. So Hilary Hahn, Tchaikovsky, and Higdon. It's a wonderful disc. It really is. Okay, yeah, we got to do this one. See, these are all in boxes. Gil Shaham. Gil Shaham, this is such a great box of stuff. He was such a gifted violinist. And I think in a way it was his misfortune that when he was initially making recordings for Deutsche Grammophon, there were just so many of them out there, so many people out there, so many violinists, so many people all doing the same stuff. And so I don't think he got quite as much attention, even though he was on Deutsche Grammophon. And he was being very vigorously promoted at least by the New York wing of Universal, by Deutsche Grammophon here in New York. But then they just unceremoniously dropped him, and now he has his own label, Canary Classics, where he gets to do all the stuff that's on here all over again. But this is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful performance. I have to actually take a look and tell you who it's with, because I wasn't even looking at it. I just know that I love the performance. I don't even pay attention. Hang on. Oh, there's the Barbara Korngold. Oh, what a great disc that was. Oh, that was wonderful. And then we have Mendelssohn and Dvorak, which is lovely. And then we have this and that. Tchaikovsky, not that Tchaikovsky. We have to get the other Tchaikovsky. Where's the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto? Don't tell me it isn't in here and that I'm just hallucinating, which is always a possibility. Schubert, where did it go? Up there it is. Yes, the Philharmonia was Sinopoli coupled with Sibelius, which some of you mentioned when I did the Sibelius thing. It's a very good Sibelius, a wonderful Tchaikovsky, gorgeously recorded. Sinopoli is a fun conductor for that stuff because he's into late romantic, decadent schlock and that kind of stuff. So, but Shaham is a class act all the way through, soup to nuts. And Sinopoli provides a very warm and cozy environment in which he can operate and display his violinistic skills. So Gil Shaham and Sinopoli is a lot of fun. It's just a lot of fun. Now let's talk about some people who did, the famous ones who did some multiple versions. We're going to do like a few of those. But the first one here, obviously, that we need to talk about is Perlman. Perlman really, for maybe 5 or 10 years in like the 80s, kind of owned the Tchaikovsky Concerto. It was a signature piece of his. He didn't really own it because Milstein owned it. Well, we're going to get to him, but this is his first one with Leinsdorf, and I like his Leinsdorf stuff the best. I think there's a certain freshness and vivacity that he didn't quite always match in his remakes, of which I think there are at least 2. I haven't even looked. Because once you get the name, you get the name, and you know what he's going to do. And Perlman was the epitome of the yummy, romantic, warm, lush, big tone. Really, the successor or the inheritor of the Russian school, that Russian tradition. And he's wonderful at it. He's absolutely wonderful at it. It's fantastic stuff. So I just think his Tchaikovsky Concerti, all of them, are very, very beautiful. But I like these earlier RCA ones because, when his EMI stuff came along, he wanted the microphone right in the violin. And he was very honest about it. He said, they want to hear me. They don't care about the orchestra. That is also sort of the attitude of the great violin virtuosi of the past, especially back in the days when they really couldn't capture the orchestra, so it didn't matter. All that mattered was the violin. And, Perlman's not quite that bad. He's not. But he's very, very front and center, and thank God he withstands the scrutiny. He really does. I mean, he's quite something in this piece. And so I go with Perlman and Leinsdorf. You're in great shape with it on RCA. And if you want to get one of the later ones, be my guest. They're beautiful. You can't go wrong. Absolutely can't go wrong. Well, another duplicate guy was Isaac Stern. He did it with Ormandy, which is here in this Ormandy Does Tchaikovsky box. And he did it with Bernstein, which I always thought was kind of fascinating because they were rather close together in time, actually. But, they're both wonderful. They really are. I mean, Ormandy was a great Tchaikovsky conductor. Bernstein was a great Tchaikovsky conductor, but they were quite different. Bernstein is a little bit more, shall we say, interventionist than Ormandy was, particularly as a concerto accompanist. Stern is great in both of them. He's also another one of those guys who is, heir to that wonderful romantic tradition of violin playing. He is roundly castigated by certain people in certain circles for not being as good as, fill in the blank of violinist X. Yes, he is. Stern is a tremendous violinist. He was a very, very gifted interpreter of this music. He plays it with as if to the manner born, and it's up to you which one you want. You can pick and choose and make yourself happy. They're really quite similar, actually. Although, like I said, the accompaniments are different, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. But Stern is Stern. He doesn't radically revise his view of the work, I don't think. I just think he sounds beautiful, and they're very affecting performances. So Stern is terrific. Also, Oistrakh. Now, Oistrakh, we've got 2 of them here, and of course there are Melodio ones too. So we're not, you can have hundreds of Tchaikovsky violin concertos, all with the same people, which is just humongous, I think, sort of like waste of time. But, that's me. With Ormandy, gorgeous. I mean, what do you expect? It's gorgeous, fabulous, just like with Isaac Stern. It's gorgeous and fabulous. This is that disc on alto some of you mentioned that has the Sibelius concerto. And, it's a good transfer. It sounds okay. I mean, it's not first-class sound, but it's good enough for sure. And this one is mono, but this is with Konvichny in the Staatskapelle Dresden, which I think is awfully interesting. And it's very good mono, and Oistrakh is in really wonderful form, and this is also in the early 50s in that area, mid 50s, just before the stereo era. And he plays wonderfully, and it's really great to hear Konvichny and the Staatskapelle Dresden doing that music from that period. It really is fun. And so I don't know which one to pick. You take your choice. They're both great. They both have very distinctive accompanists. In this case, they sound quite different, the accompanists anyway. And Oistrakh is Oistrakh. He was one of the greats. So that's that pile of them, pair of them. That's a good way. If they do more than one, I can save some time and do multiple performances at once instead of having to do them one at a time. Oh, yeah, because we've got more of those coming, too. Oh, yeah. So now we have some interesting ones coming up. I think that you will find extremely interesting. Another violinist you guys beat me up for not mentioning frequently enough is Leonid Kogan, who is fantastic as well. He does a great Beethoven concerto, and he does a great Prokofiev second concerto. That's on this disc. This is on Testament. And the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, which is, let's see, it's with, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra under Konstantin Silvestri. No, it's with André van der Noot, which is just as good in my view. Van der Noot was a fine conductor. And of course, the Paris Conservatoire is the Paris Conservatoire. It's absolutely wonderful. So this is fun to listen to. And Kogan is great. He's the Russian school. The Russian school, and Tchaikovsky was Russian, so Russians do Russian music generally pretty well. And Kogan, of course, was one of the greats, and he was a little bit dwarfed by Oistrakh. And so a lot, I think, of the boosterism behind Kogan has to do with, sort of rooting for the underdog. If there were other Russian violinists besides Oistrakh, and Kogan was one of them, just as there were other Russian pianists besides Richter, which is kind of the impetus behind the Gilels lobby. They were pushing him because everybody was talking about Richter all the time. So Kogan gets a little bit of that kind of underdog promotion, but heavens, he deserves it. He's a wonderful, wonderful artist with another beautiful, rich tone, and it's a lovely performance, and it's fun to hear the Paris Conservatory Orchestra as the accompanist. And that brings up actually another issue. Let me put it there. And the issue is this. The Tchaikovsky concerto is so violinistically heavy that you can really get away with it if the orchestra is pretty mediocre and you don't hear it all that well, the accompaniment is kind of slovenly. I mean, you can, because the violin is just so front and center the whole time. It's not like the Sibelius, where even though it's a Mendelssohn style concerto form, which has the soloist come in right away, and the orchestra is not going to be independently defined for any length of time, it's still it has a very different kind of balance between the solo and the accompaniment. So you can get away with that. You can get away with having the soloist always front and center in the performance, and the accompanist sort of along for the ride. The orchestra and the conductor just keep up. But if you do have a conductor who has a personality and who wants to bring something to the table, it works equally well that way too. And there are countless felicities and subtleties of orchestration that Tchaikovsky reveals, which are wonderful if you get to hear them behind the violin. One of them is just in the finale. the violin's going. If you listen carefully, like the second time it comes around, behind that, there are these wonderful wind chords, delicious little repeated chords in the winds. The violin's going, and the winds are going in the background. And if you can balance that, oh my, what a wonderful sound it makes. Just what a delightfully enchanting sonority. And there are a lot of moments like that in this concerto. There really are, but it all depends on whether the soloist lets the conductor get away with it or the conductor imposes himself on the work enough. And you can do it either way. And it's one of the things actually that makes performances of this piece so much fun to compare, because there are so many little details that you can hear in some performances but not in others. And it's also why historical recordings of the piece tended to work, because when all you could hear was the violin part, it still worked. I mean, you wanted to hear more orchestra, but if you couldn't, it was okay, because the violin wasn't stopping. It was going to be hacking away no matter what. So that's something to keep in mind when you're listening to these performances, whether you really want to hear the orchestra or whether you only care about the soloist. And neither way is right. The piece is like most pieces of music. It's very hardy, and it sustains multiple visions of how it should be played. One vision that I really think most of you probably haven't heard, but you really should, is this one on Superfon with Pavel Sporchel, who's a wonderful violinist. My goodness, a young Czech violinist, plays the bejesus out of it, and it's absolutely fantastic. You've got the Dvorak and the Tchaikovsky, and you've got Vladimir Ashkenazy and Jiří Bělohlavek conducting. And what makes this even more fun is that Ashkenazy is conducting the Dvorak and Bělohlavek is conducting the Tchaikovsky. It's just the opposite of the way you'd think it would normally go. But they're both spectacular, and Sporchel is just great. He's real, or I should say Sporchel. That's how you pronounce it. He's a Sporchel. He's really, really, really good. Young, fresh, vivacious, dynamic, soulful in the canzonetta. He really, really milks the piece in the best possible way. It's a beautiful performance that will all too easily be overlooked simply because he's not a big name here in the West and because Superfon recordings don't get that kind of attention. But this is a class act all the way through for both the Dvorak and the Tchaikovsky. And it's an interesting coupling because you usually don't hear these two works together, but they are, roughly contemporaneous, and they both had equal birthing pains. Dvorak wrote it for Joachim, who never played it, and told Dvorak to revise it 150 times, and Dvorak refused. And the Tchaikovsky was supposed to be dedicated to Auer, and Auer did the same thing with Tchaikovsky and tortured him over it. It's very interesting. Very, very interesting. They were both written at the time when the composer was not quite the king of the hill when faced with the demands of a big name soloist. But the composers won at the end of the day, and here they are. Sporchel, very, very good on Superfon, with Ashkenazy and Bělohlavek. And of course, we have to talk about Heifetz, who recorded it multiple times in the 78 era, but this is his stereo recording with Fritz Reiner and Chicago. Yeah, they also did the Brahms. We talked about that. Total hotness. Well, this Tchaikovsky is just to be, Heifetz. That's what I keep saying whenever we come up with Heifetz. It's like, Heifetz, what are you going to do? Heifetz. It's Heifetz. It is of a technical polish and scrupulosity that is really outrageous. Absolutely outstanding and exciting. And for those of you who would prefer what they call a cooler interpretation, I think that Heifetz is perfect. I actually have a little something to tell you about this hot and cold business that I think is very interesting. It's an acoustical phenomenon. One of the things that I pointed out in my various writings about, tragedy or music that's tragic is that tragedy and misery are easy. Emotion is easy. Expressivity is easy. Because in music, it's just a function of time. I mean, if you want to do sad music, all you have to do is jump into a minor key and sit there. And the longer you hang out, the sadder the music gets, because it's merely a function of the same mood over time. Sadness is a function of sameness. Happiness, humor, God forbid, is not. That is a function of contrast and change. And that's why humor and happiness is vastly more difficult to achieve musically than sadness. And I also think this applies to some of the way people feel about Heifetz. Heifetz is not less expressive or less passionate than anyone else out there. He just gives the impression of being cooler because he lingers less. That's what happens. And that means that the passion, the expression that Heifetz, I think, expresses comes through different means. There has to be a way to do it without sitting there on your minor key or whatever note or whatever passage and noodling with it. Because Heifetz was not a noodler. He does it through the intensity of his vibrato, through the pressure of the bow on the string. He does it with phrasing and accent, but these are all much more subjective qualities. They're much harder to pin down, especially on a casual listen, than somebody who simply, sits on a phrase and milks it for all it's worth. And so that's why Heifetz, I think, gets this sort of reputation for being a little bit on the cool side, but I don't hear it. I don't think it's true. I really think that they're just different ways to the same ends. And Heifetz had his. And part of his was just the superb technical perfection that was characteristic of everything that he did. And there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, Heifetz and Reiner, they're a big deal in the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. Also, now here's one some of you might not have heard, and it's a historical recording. It's from 52 or 54, somewhere in there. But this is just one of the great Tchaikovsky concerti, and with one of the great violinists of the 20th century who's not at all well known, and that's Ivry Gitlis. Gitlis, he died in 2020. He was 98, living in Paris. He was a legend among violinists because here's a guy who was so individual. He was so personal. People held him in awe. You never knew what you were going to get with him. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that in the Fort Wanglerian way, which means, it all went to hell or, it could be amazing. No, Gitlis was usually amazing, but in wildly different ways. He said once, one of his quotes was that rubato is the art of playing in tempo. And that is so much a truth about his own style. He had a freedom and flexibility of phrasing that was unlike anybody else in the business. And I want to play you a little bit just so you get a sense of it. I think he was one of the great masters at making the violin speak, at sounding as though he were saying something to you individually every time you listen to him. So I want you to hear the opening of the finale in this performance. This is with the Vienna Symphony under Heinrich Hohlreiser. It's not one for which you're going to choose the orchestra as an equal participant, but they're not bad. They're okay. And the point is that just listen to the way he phrases it, and then the way he somehow just takes off like a shot. In the finale, the orchestra sort of hanging on for dear life, trying to catch up. They do that with Morini too, and they actually don't catch up at one point. But here they manage to stay with him for the most part. But my God, how expressive this is. Expressive, but also disciplined. It's really an amazing combination. And I don't think you hear it quite the same way with any other violinist. I really don't. So let me give you a little bit of the finale featuring Ivry Gitlis in the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. This is really special. Listen to that violin speak. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, did you hear it? I hope you did. I hope you have other versions that you can compare this to. This is a Vox recording. It's not expensive, by the way. It's still around. And you get the Tchaikovsky, the Bruch, the Sibelius, the Mendelssohn, and the Bartók Second Violin Concerto, and Sonata for Solo Violin, all on 2 CDs. That's a pretty good deal. So I think this is, one of those essential violin collection discs, even if the sound is a little bit, mono, who cares? This is violin playing of the very, very highest quality. And Gitlis did not make a lot of recordings. He was best known for doing a lot of contemporary music, and he had tons of stuff dedicated to him because his technique and his sound was just so extraordinary. He hypnotized people. And you can hear why in this performance of the Tchaikovsky. So I think Gitlis is something that everybody should hear. I really do. Next, well, we already have spoken about her previously, Mullova, because we just did a Sibelius repertoire video, and here she was, and here's the disc. And I told you it would be back for the Tchaikovsky because these are 2 equally superb performances. This is with Ozawa in Boston. She has this wonderful, rich, dusky tone. The Sibelius is fabulously atmospheric and dark. And I think the same qualities, that same sort of brooding melancholy, if you want to call it that, gives the Tchaikovsky an extra element of intensity and also polish, because her technique is very, very polished, and she does not ooze all over the music. Not at all. She has a sternness and a steeliness to her, which I think is just so powerful. And it's so powerful in this music because the Tchaikovsky, as you know, I mean, it can disintegrate into just, a puddle. And Mullova is never into the puddle. She does not step into the puddle. She does not melt into a puddle. She's not a puddle lady. She is a very strong, powerful violinistic personality, and it comes through in every note of this performance. So yes, Mullova we have to talk about. However, oh boy, we have to make a pick, don't we? And that pick, like I said, the other person who owned this piece, aside from Perlman slightly after Milstein retired, was Milstein. And Milstein recorded it at least 3 or 4 times. There's also, aside from these 2, this is the EMI one, the Warner one, there's this one. And then there's a Charles Munch mono one, which is quite fine also with Boston. And then there's this one, which is my pick. It's the stereo last one he did with Claudio Abbado and the Vienna Philharmonic, and it's just, it's the end of a life of impeccable, unbelievably noble and rich and tasteful and just beautiful violin playing. I mean, Milstein was the guy. I saw him play this like 3 or 4 times. I don't know how he did it so many times. He was so well known for doing the Tchaikovsky, and he was superb. He was just superb. He had an aristocratic polish in the music that just elevated the whole thing. It really did. And at the same time, I mean, he was another hour pupil, like Heifetz was. I mean, he was as expressive and as warm and humane and emotionally intense as anybody out there. But he was kind of like the Claudio Arrau of violinists, if you want to put it that way. He just had this beautiful tone, and everything that he touched turned to gold. It really did. He was just extraordinary that way. And so I think Milstein and Abato is a great way to sort of get yourself going with the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto collection, assuming you're going to own hundreds of them at some point. This is coupled with the Mendelssohn, which is equally fine. And it's one of the great violin records out there. It really is. This is on Penguin Classics. But, it's still around, probably. I mean, there's a little DG set of all the Milstein recordings. And they're absolutely magnificent. You should have them all. I mean, because you get the Brahms with Joachim, and you get the Bach sonatas and partitas. I mean, it's a great little set. It's just like 4 discs, I think, 3 or 4 discs. You get this. So I think that Milstein and Tchaikovsky has to be acknowledged as one of the great happenings in the violin concerto world in the second half of the 20th century. And that, my friends, is all I have to say about the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. I hope this has given you some food for thought and more than enough information so that you can go out there and get yourself a performance that really suits you. Keep on listening, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.